welcome to Malaysia,
where the landscapes are as beautiful and diverse as the people living here, and you can walk from China to India within the space of 5 minutes.
The diversity here really interested me, so because of that, we headed on over to the Kuala Lumpur National Museum.
The National Museum gave me a lot to think about. We learnt so much here about how colonisation affected the country, and something really struck a chord with me here. Looking back at my own family story and thinking about how colonisation affected our heritage and history on a more personal level, I felt compelled to delve deeper on the subject. Colonisation is such a huge part of history that I don't think is covered nearly in enough detail in the UK, but something that has shaped not only cultural identities abroad, but also at home in the UK too. The more I find out, the more intrigued I become. So I then decided to pick up The Gift of Rain to learn a little bit more about Penang's history. The Gift of Rain is set in Penang in 1939 for the outbreak of World War II. It's about a boy who is half Chinese and half British and how he navigates the world in Malaya being mixed race. It's a story about betrayal, deceit, divided loyalties, and a kind of coming of age story.
The Gift of Rain was written by Tan Twan Eng and published in 2007, and it was actually longlisted for the Man Booker Prize that year as well. So we're off to do a deep dive of the book today and explore the places that are in the book in real life. But first, let me give you some context with a brief history of Malaysia. In history, Malaysia has always been a place for strong trade. In 1400, the Sultanate in Malacca was established and the country was seen as a prosperous trading port given its position between the east and the west. In 1511, however, the colonisation of Malaya began. The country was first colonised by the Portuguese and was then colonised by the Dutch in 1641, which lasted 183 years. This then brings us to this man, Francis Light. Francis Light was a British captain in service of the East India Trading Company. In a nutshell, Light arrived in Penang in 1786 to use Penang as a trading post. The Sultan at the time was facing threats from Siam and would only agree to this in exchange for protection. The East India Trading Company did not agree to this, and Light took over Penang with the promise of military aid, which was not guaranteed by the company, nor was it ever given. Light refused to leave, and the Sultan was eventually forced to sign an agreement that gave the British the right to occupy Penang. In Malacca, the British signed a treaty with the Dutch called the Anglo-Dutch Treaty. Pretty simple name, right? And this is when it was deemed that the Britain colonised Malaya. The British capitalised on Malaya's natural resource, rubber, through this time, and used it as their main export. They also brought in workers from India and China to work on rubber plantations. By the 1920s to 1930s, a rise in nationalism was increasing in Malaya due to an increase in access to education and spreading awareness through journalism. However, in 1941, the Japanese occupied Malaya, and well, this is where The Gift of Rain takes place. The Japanese occupation ended in 1945 after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the British returned. However, dissatisfaction was growing, especially since the British left the country behind during the occupation. In 1948, the emergency period started with the murder of 3 rubber planters by the Malaya Racist Liberation Army, which were a guerrilla insurgency group that aimed to destroy rubber plantations, government installations, and create communist control. This period of civil unrest continued until 1960, although sources say that the violence became more isolated throughout the 50s. The emergence of Tunku Abdul Rahman united the ideals of the Malays, Chinese and Indians and formed the Alliance Party. This party led to the signing of the London Agreement, which granted Malaya's independence on the 31st of August 1957. On the 20th of February 1956, Tunku Abdul Rahman addressed the nation, informing them of their independence, saying,
Merdeka! 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 Merdeka!
Phew, are you still with me? Alright, let's get back to The Gift of Rain.
I absolutely loved this book. It was a 5-star, chef's kiss, magnificent book. I will say, it was pretty darn sad. Probably sadder than A Little Life. I know, the shock, I didn't think a book could be sadder than that. But this book was just so interestingly written, it was so beautiful, and what I loved is the perspective of it was so interesting. So Philip Hutton, like I said before, is a mixed race character, and the way that the author describes his experiences and navigating the world and the nuances of being mixed race is so interesting. I've recently done a lot of self-exploration, I think you could say, about being mixed race myself, and I think that what he captures in the books are some of the feelings that like I felt of not feeling like enough of one race, or not really having a place, or not really fitting in. I think he captures that perfectly, and I think that's also something that comes up in the book The Mixed Race Experience, which I would also recommend if you are on a journey to find your racial identity, as I have been recently. It's a really interesting, really beautiful exploration of those themes. Not only does it capture the diversity of the character really well and his life growing up, but it also captures the diversity of Malaya really, really well. Philip talks about how much of a diverse place Malaya was to grow up in. He talks about the Chinese influence in places like Campbell Street, the Indie influence in Chaurasta Market, and places like Armenian Street, and finally places like Burma Street, where we are now, and Bangkok Lane, which is a bit further out. So it's just a beautifully written book. I remember listening to some of the lines. I did listen to the audiobook for this one, and some of the lines just jumped out at me. It's just being so beautifully written that it just took my breath away, and something that I could never think of myself. When you find a book and it's just like, wow, like your mind is just so wonderfully creative. That's how I felt reading some of these lines, and I think the beauty of the writing really deepens your understanding of the history, but it does so in a way that the history isn't boring. The author does note he does take some poetic license, and like some of the historical events that happen in the book aren't necessarily what happened in real life, but the general tone of the Japanese ruled Malaya is still holds true basically. But the history he tells, the history that is true in the book, really helps with deepening your understanding of Malaya's history, and it's told in a way that is also really engaging. And I think even if the events are taking some artistic license, they still help you understand what it was like to live in that era, and it's still very poignant, and it's very visceral at times, and very hard to read at times, but also important, and also really interesting, and also really sad. And anyone who knows me, I love a sad book. A book that makes me sit in bed staring at the wall in pain is a book that I'm going to rate 5 stars on Goodreads. And the last thing what I really love about the book is how he incorporates loads of different places that are in real life. So we've come today to bring the book to life, and we're starting at Penang Hill. In the book, Philip takes Endo-san up Penang Hill, but instead of taking the funicular like we did, he takes him up the jungle path and on a 3-hour hike up Penang Hill. And Philip finds it really difficult, but Endo-san is the one who's pushing it and wants it so he can get the lay of the land. I feel like just walking along this bypath, you can kind of see how jungly it is. We're lucky enough to have a path, but I don't think Philip and Endo-san did. And whilst Philip and Endo-san did walk up the Penang Hill, Isabel and the other women of Penang went up on the funicular to escape the Japanese invasion in Malaya. They did come down in the end, but I assume they stayed in places like Victorian House behind me for safety reasons. When Philip takes Endo-san up Penang Hill, he mentions about how the British come up to Penang Hill to get away from the hot weather in the lowlands, and we actually saw that in Cameron Highlands. There's this massive colonial house where you can still get cream tea, and it just shows that like people used to come up to the highlands to get away from the hot heat in Malaya. And you can see that like the British made their impact with their post boxes. So this is a colonial post box, and it says on the sign down here that the post boxes are still used in Malaysia to this day. Our next stop is Fort Cornwallis. Fort Cornwallis was built by the British when they landed in Penang Island and took Penang Island from the Sultan on the 11th of August 1786. Fort Cornwallis was never actually used as a fighting point or used in battle. It was just a base for British troops and also the home for the East India Trading Company. In the book, the Japanese use Fort Cornwallis as a prison, and they keep Noel Hutton, Philip Hutton's dad, here as a prisoner towards the end of the book. In real life, the Japanese did use Fort Cornwallis as a base, but not as a prison from what I can see. They used it as, like the British did, as a warehouse. Fort Cornwallis is just an example of the many places and architecture around Penang that stems from the colonial roots. And I think it's really important to come and see places like this to understand their history and learn a bit more about what happened. As it is called in the book. On our way to our next stop, we stumbled across St George's Church, and then I remembered this is actually in the book as well. So this is where Philip and his family would come for weekly services. Also, when taking Endo-san around Penang, Philip comes here and shows him the choir and tells him that he used to sing as a choir boy in the church as well. So this is the Blue Mansion. I wasn't originally going to come here, just because it was only mentioned like briefly one time in the book and I wasn't sure it existed. And then I got to the end of the book and there's an author's note and it tells you that like it's a real place and to come and see it. So I'm glad we did because it's real beauty. The Blue Mansion is quite an important part of the book, even if it is mentioned in passing. It is where Noel Hutton and his second wife, Philip's mother, meet in the book. We made our way over from the Blue Mansion to Beach Street. In the book and in real life, this is where the banks primarily are, and the workplace of the Hutton family, Huttons and Sons, would be along Beach Street. He also says that this is the road where like the business centres happen, and then going back is where it separates into the Chinese, the Indian, and the Malay sections as we've seen walking through. Although the people in the book are fictional, and the author makes a note of saying that the Huttons and Endo-san and everyone in the book is fictional, the names are seemingly based on streets and places in real life. As you just saw, we're on Hutton Street right now, so the name of the Huttons presumably comes from here. There's also McAllister Street, and there's Peter McAllister in the book, and a lot of different places like that around, which I think is a really cool Easter egg if you come to Penang to see. Everything is in walking distance, and it kind of boggles my mind because in the book it feels like things are really spaced out, but I'm walking and I'm suddenly at all the different places. It's really cool to come here and see. And finally, we've made it over to Kimberley Street, which is also mentioned in the book as a place of Chinese influence. And we've come for some street food. So today we're having asam laksa and some papaya, which is spring rolls.
The asam laksa was absolutely delicious and completely different from the laksa we had before. The asam laksa is tamarind based rather than coconut based, and so is a lot more sour, but so delicious. Carl even preferred it to the coconut based one. And as our time came to an end here in Malaysia and we boarded our train, I couldn't help but reflect on what I'd learned in our time here. I felt that I achieved on what I set out to do, but I'm still so intrigued to learn more about the effects of colonisation in different countries. This book and my time in Malaysia has only furthered my intrigue, and I can't wait to read more books to further deepen my understanding. If you have any book recommendations for any other countries, please do let me know in the comments. Also, if you like this video, don't forget to hit like, subscribe and leave a comment down below. And also hit that bell notification. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.